shadowed heart of Appalachia, there is a place locals refuse to map. They call it the Cannibal Hills. A stretch of ridges and hollows where the earth seems to swallow sound and the air always tastes of iron. For generations, people have whispered that something in those hills devours not just flesh, but the very souls of those who wander too close. And at the center of it all lies the story of one family, the Grimsby Clan. The Grimsbys weren't just poor. They were outcasts. Settling the hills in the early 1800s, they carved their homes into the stone itself, burrows and caves, reinforced with rotting wood. Unlike other Appalachian families who hunted, farmed, or traded, the Grimsbys shunned outsiders entirely. They raised their own, married their own, and buried their own in the rocky soil. Children of the clan were born with skin so pale they looked almost translucent, veins blue and pulsing beneath the surface. Some had eyes clouded from birth, others with jaws too wide, or teeth that grew crooked and sharp. The family lived off what little the forest gave: roots, vermin, the occasional unlucky deer. But whispers say their hunger was never satisfied. By the 1840s, travelers passing through the hills vanished without a trace. Hunters stumbled upon abandoned camps, fires still burning, possessions left untouched. A preacher who tried to bring the word of God into the hollow was found months later, or at least part of him was. His bones were scattered across the rocks, stripped clean. No wolf or bear leaves bones like that. It was then the legend of the Cannibal Hills was born. Neighbors swore they heard screams echoing from the ridges at night, accompanied by the sound of drums and voices chanting in a tongue no one could recognize. Sometimes, they said, you could glimpse the Grimsbys themselves, tall, gaunt figures with hollow eyes, standing on ridgelines in the moonlight, their mouths moving silently, as though whispering to the hills themselves. But there was something worse than the hunger. The Grimsbys believed the land itself was cursed. They claimed the hills were haunted by spirits that fed alongside them. To the Grimsbys, cannibalism was not just survival, it was a ritual, a way to commune with the ghosts of the mountains. When they devoured flesh, they said, they consumed not only the body, but the soul, binding it to their clan forever. Travelers who escaped told stories that chilled even hardened men. One merchant in 1857 claimed he was lured into the hills by a lantern swaying in the distance, only to find himself surrounded by pale faces emerging from the trees. They bound him, dragged him into a cavern lit by dozens of flickering candles. He swore the walls were painted with handprints, not in paint, but in blood. The Grimsbys circled him, their mouths opening wide, chanting words he could not understand. Somehow, he broke free and ran until his legs gave out. He never returned to Appalachia again by the Civil War. Even Confederate and Union soldiers refused to march through the Cannibal Hills. Stories spread of patrols vanishing without gunfire, their weapons found rusting on the ground, uniforms torn and soaked in blood. Both sides quietly agreed. The hills belonged to the Grimsbys, and whatever haunted them. Locals avoided the area entirely, but they couldn't escape the legends. On stormy nights, some claimed they saw figures moving along the hillsides, carrying torches and dragging something heavy through the mud. Others swore they heard wailing voices of the dead, carried on the wind, begging for release. Children grew up terrified of being taken by the Grimsbys, told to never wander past the last fence post, never follow strange lights into the woods, never answer if their name was called in the dark. And yet, people still disappeared. Farmers, travelers, even entire families, who strayed too close to the cursed hills. Search parties never recovered bodies. Only once, in 1883, did a man stumble out of the hollow days after vanishing. He was raving, clawing at his skin, screaming that the hills were alive. He said the Grimsbys had taken him into their caves, forced him to eat flesh alongside them. His mind shattered. He starved himself to death within a month, unable to eat anything ever again. By then, The Grimsby Clan was no longer spoken of as human. They were called specters, demons, cannibals possessed by the land itself, and the Cannibal Hills became a place where no outsider dared tread, unless they were ready to be swallowed whole. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Cannibal Hills had grown into a forbidden wasteland on every local map. Even the bravest hunters avoided the ridges, and the few who dared cut through did so only in daylight, with rifles in hand and prayers on their lips. But the Grimsbys didn't stay confined. As food grew scarce in the hills, the clan began to move further outward, crawling from their caves like shadows bleeding into the world. It started with livestock. Farmers woke to find their cattle gutted, horses dragged into the woods with their bones gnawed bare. Then came the children. In 1907, a girl named Clara Weaver vanished on her way home from a neighbor's farm. Searchers combed the woods for weeks, finding only her bonnet tangled in a thorn bush near the ridge. Her mother swore she could still hear Clara's voice crying from the hills at night, calling Mama again and again. Others reported hearing it, too, her voice, drifting in the wind, always just out of reach, luring people closer to the Grimsby Hollow. By the 1920s, reports of strange lights in the hills multiplied. Travelers swore lanterns bobbed through the trees, weaving in patterns like signals. Some who followed them never returned. Those who did claimed the lanterns were not carried by hands at all, but floated just above the ground, drawing them deeper into the forest until pale faces emerged from the dark. One survivor described the encounter with shaking horror. They were thin like corpses, their eyes like wet glass, but when they touched me, their fingers burned cold as stone. This chilling detail gave rise to a new theory. The Grimsbys were no longer entirely alive. Generations of inbreeding, cannibalism, and ritual had fused them with the restless spirits they worshipped. They were something in between, flesh that moved, but souls long since surrendered. During Prohibition, bootleggers attempted to use the hills as a hidden route. Most never made it through. Barrels of moonshine were found smashed in streams, the footprints around them too distorted to be human. One group that did escape claimed they were ambushed, not with guns, but with screams. Dozens of Grimsbys, gaunt and skeletal, emerged from the caves, shrieking in unison, their mouths filled with blackened teeth. The bootleggers fled in terror, abandoning their cargo. Years later, they still swore the screams followed them for miles, echoing through the trees, even when the clan was no longer in sight. As the decades rolled on, hikers, explorers, and thrill-seekers tested their courage in the Cannibal Hills. Few left with anything more than terror. In 1954, a pair of hunters stumbled upon a cavern carved into the hillside. Inside, they found bones, stacked like firewood, piled to the ceiling. Some were ancient and brittle, others still dripped with blood. The hunters ran, but one never made it home. The survivor later admitted he saw his friend dragged screaming back into the cave by three pale figures, their eyes glowing in the dark like coals. Stranger still were the hauntings. Families living miles away claimed to see apparitions at their windows at night, then grinning faces staring in, vanishing when lamps were lit. Others swore the hills themselves shifted, paths changing, trees rearranging, leading wanderers in circles until they collapsed in exhaustion. When questioned, older locals only said the same words: the Grimsbys are feeding the hills, and the hills are feeding them. By the 1960s, the legend was so ingrained that even law enforcement refused to enter the hollow. When 3 teenagers went missing after a bonfire party near the ridge, the sheriff publicly declared they had run away, but townsfolk whispered differently. Days after, a hiker reported seeing 3 pale figures wandering the hills, their skin peeling, their mouths open in silent screams, as if the missing teens had been remade into something less than human. The worst stories, however, came from those who claimed to hear the feasts. On moonless nights, hunters resting too close described the sound of drums in the distance, followed by a chorus of voices chanting in harmony. Then, the tearing of flesh, the snapping of bone, and the shrieks of victims carried on the wind. Some said the cries didn't belong only to the living. They swore they heard voices they recognized as relatives, lost children, friends buried years ago wailing from the hills as though their souls had been bound to the Grimsby clan forever. By then, the Cannibal Hills weren't just a cursed place. They had become a prison of spirits, each life devoured and trapped within the clan's ritual. Every missing person, every scream, every shredded body became another layer of horror stitched into the soil. Still, the Grimsbys did not vanish. Their caves remained alive with firelight, their figures still spotted on ridge lines, their voices still calling from the trees. Generations had passed, yet the family endured, kept alive by flesh, by ritual, and by the haunted hills that had become their altar. By the late 20th century, the Cannibal Hills had become a dare among teenagers and a curse among the elders. Every town within 30 miles had a story of someone who wandered too close and never returned. Yet, as the world modernized, outsiders grew curious. Folklorists, paranormal investigators, and thrill-seeking explorers began to test the old warnings. What they found only deepened the terror. In 1979, a group of college students from Kentucky brought tape recorders into the hills, hoping to capture evidence of the Grimsby legends. They never returned. Weeks later, their abandoned car was found at the trailhead, doors hanging open, belongings inside untouched. But the recordings, several cassettes scattered in the dirt, were recovered. When played, they revealed hours of forest noise, then faint voices chanting in a language no one recognized. One tape ended with blood-curdling screams and the sound of dozens of hands pounding against wood, as if on walls or coffins. Experts analyzed the audio for years, but could never explain it. In the 1990s, thrill-seekers with camcorders tried their luck. Some returned shaken, insisting the hills had swallowed their sense of direction, paths twisting back on themselves. One video surfaced briefly online, showing pale figures at the tree line too tall, limbs too long, mouths opening wider than humanly possible. The video was quickly scrubbed, the uploader claiming they had come for him. Whether that was paranoia or truth, no one ever heard from him again. Then came the stories of modern hikers. In 2003, two brothers camping near the ridge were awoken at night by footsteps circling their tent. They shone a flashlight and saw nothing but the footsteps continued, closer and closer, until the fabric bulged inward as though hands pressed from outside. Terrified, they fled, abandoning their gear. When searchers recovered the campsite, the tent was torn to shreds, claw marks embedded in the soil around it. Others have described the same phenomenon, voices calling their names, always in the tone of loved ones. One woman swore she heard her late father's voice begging her to come deeper into the hollow. Only her husband's desperate grip kept her from following it. She later admitted the voice sounded so real she nearly wept. The Grimsbys, it seems, had grown more than a clan. They had become part of the hills themselves. Witnesses claimed to see lights flickering in caves that no map acknowledges, hear laughter in the distance when no one else is near, and glimpse shadows moving against the stars. Some researchers suggest the family no longer survives as flesh and blood, but exists in a half-dead state, feeding on both the living and the lost souls trapped in their rituals. And yet, the disappearances have never stopped. As recently as 2019, 2 hikers vanished while exploring the area with drones and GPS. Their last recorded footage showed something chilling, a cave mouth yawning open beneath a ridge, lined with bones like teeth. Just before the feed cut out, the camera caught a pale figure crawling out, its eyes glowing in the infrared light, its jaw unhinging wider than humanly possible. Neither hiker was ever found. Today, the Cannibal Hills remain untouched by development, avoided even by loggers and surveyors. Locals still refuse to speak of the Grimsbys aloud, believing their very name feeds the curse. Some claim the clan still survives in the caves, thin and pale, gnawing on the bones of anyone unlucky enough to wander in. Others believe they've transcended flesh entirely, their spirits bound to the land, haunting the hills as a warning to all who dare enter. But the truth remains this: people still go missing. Voices still echo from the hills, and the Grimsby legend has never died. If you stand at the base of the ridge on a moonless night and listen closely, you may hear them, the drums, the chanting, and the gnashing of teeth tearing into flesh. And if the wind carries your name from the dark, whispered in the voice of someone you love, don't answer. Because in the Cannibal Hills of Appalachia, once the Grimsbys have your soul in their grasp, it never escapes. The Grimsby clan didn't just haunt the hills, they became them. Their rituals, their hunger, their cruelty are etched into the very soil, making the Cannibal Hills one of Appalachia's most terrifying legends. But this is just one of many families the mountains refuse to let us forget. Do you think the Grimsbys still live, hidden in caves, or are their spirits all that remain? Let me know in the comments below. And if you made it this far, you've proven you're brave enough to face horrors most can't. Be sure to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell, because there are still darker families, more twisted bloodlines, and even hungrier legends waiting in the shadows. Remember, in Appalachia, the hills are alive and, sometimes, they're hungry.